Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessel Noor in Baltimore. Chicago Mayor Rahm Emmanuel is headed to a runoff after he failed to gain 50% of Tuesday's votes in the city's mayoral election. The former Obama administration chief of staff will face his closest challenger, Cook County Commissioner Jesus Chuy Garcia, who got 35% in an April runoff. Emmanuel has been a lightning rod for controversy during his first 4 years as he's pushed austerity, faced a historic strike by the Chicago Teachers Union, closed 50 public schools and mental health clinics, while the city has maintained one of the highest murder rates in the country. Well, now joining us to discuss all of this from Chicago is Kari Lydersen. Kari is a longtime Chicago journalist, the author of Mayor 1%, Rahm Emanuel, and the Rise of Chicago's 99%. Thanks so much for joining us again.
Hi, thank you.
So despite Rahm, or as you refer to, Mayor 1%, spending an overwhelming amount of money against his much lesser-known opponents and getting none other than President Obama to campaign for him, Emmanuel has been forced into this unlikely runoff. What's your reaction, and what's the mood in a lot of the communities in Chicago where a lot of the resentment over his policies has really come from?
Yeah, I think the mood among a lot of people is pretty buoyant. Kind of surprised, I think, even though recent polls had shown a runoff was likely, there did seem to just be a sense both from national pundits and from regular people that just with all this money, Rahm would have it locked down. So I think there's among the many opponents of Rahm, a lot of surprise, relief, excitement, definitely excitement, and the idea that this is literally the first time in history that there'll be a runoff in the mayoral election since they've had this nonpartisan structure. So not only is it a runoff, but it's a runoff between two people who represent really different political personalities and visions for the city. So it's pretty exciting. It's a pretty big deal.
So talk about what the key issues were in this election and why, even as an incumbent, Emmanuel couldn't get that 50% plus one vote he needed.
Yeah, he is just really from day one, or even before he actually took office 4 years ago, alienated really a lot of people and really important constituencies in Chicago. You mentioned the teachers union. He's had sort of this war with the teachers union the whole time that he's been in office. He alienated the tens of thousands of members of that union and the Chicago parents during the teachers' strike. He really has just made it clear in so many ways that I could talk more about that he doesn't value or want the input of regular Chicagoans or of different groups that throughout the history of the city have actually gotten respect from past mayors. He doesn't want to have to deal with them. He's made decisions in a really autocratic way. It's really been both the things that he's done and the way that he's gone about doing those things that has caused so much discontent, and then the actual impacts, the way that a lot of neighborhoods, people in the south and west sides of the city in particular, have felt like they're just really their living situation, their neighborhoods, their infrastructure, their well-being has gotten worse since he's been in office, even as he's made downtown and parts of the north side as more attractive, shinier, better.
And so these are key issues that his opponents seized on. Talk more about what his opponents kind of ran on and why that message was so effective.
Mm-hmm. Well, the closing of the almost 50 public schools was a big deal that affected many, many tens of thousands of parents and kids. It affected them on a day-to-day level because they lost the schools they'd felt really connected to. And it also was the perfect symbol of what I mentioned earlier, his really autocratic way of running the city and this sort of austerity and privatization approach, and a decision that was made with very little transparency and a very kind of bullying attitude toward the public. So that was a big issue. Crime was also a big issue. I don't know that, that is a little bit more complicated in terms of what Rahm had to do with it, but people definitely feel like they're not, they're living in dangerous situations and the city's not reaching out to them. The mental health clinics actually was an issue in the campaign. This was something where Rahm Emanuel had closed 6 of the city's 12 public mental health clinics in his first budget, his first year in office. And that has continued to be a huge issue, both because it resulted in layoffs and in a lot of people with mental health problems homes, losing access to their care, and again also symbolize the idea that if people's needs and vulnerabilities are, an economic drag on the city, then they're just out of luck. And out in the cold. So these were, the kinds of messages that his opponents were pushing.
And tell us about Chuy Garcia, the man that Rahm Emmanuel will be facing off in April.
Yeah, so Chuy Garcia got into the race not until October, late in the game, because Karen Lewis, the president of the teachers union, had generated this really burst and groundswell of excitement. She'd, been squaring off with Rahm during the teachers' strike and the school closings battle, and was actually pulling ahead of Rahm in the summer. And she's African American. She represented, the African American community and the whole concept of organized labor and of the 99% that has been into throughout Rahm's tenure. So she was looking like she had a chance to beat him. And then in one of just those shocking stories, she was diagnosed with brain cancer in the fall and had to withdraw from the race. And that's when Karen herself and other supporters basically enlisted Chuy Garcia to run. So Chuy Garcia is someone that was the first Latino state legislator in Illinois, and he had been a city councilman and alderman during Harold Washington's administration, the first Black mayor of Chicago, a Mexican immigrant himself who grew up and still lives in the Pilsen and Little Village neighborhoods, someone who really represents, he's currently a Cook County commissioner, someone who basically represents, the almost polar opposite of the things that Mayor Emmanuel represents, someone that has a really deep history in Chicago politics and state politics at a number of different levels, but has been known as someone who is a champion for progressive issues and for the underdog, and who operates in a community-oriented, democratic way, very different from the way people see Mayor Emmanuel.
And it wasn't just the mayor's race headed to a runoff. Several members of the city council will also be facing runoffs in April, and 12, I think it's 18, which is a third of the total, and 12 of them were backed by Rahm. So it's not just a referendum on Rahm, really. It seems like referendum on his allies as well.
Right, it's a referendum on a whole system. I mean, Chicago has been known for decades as having a rubber stamp city council where the aldermen, even the so-called progressive or independent aldermen, it's very rare that they ever vote against the mayor's wishes. And this rubber stamp tendency had gotten even stronger during Rahm's time in office. So it was just a given. The mayor has always been so powerful in Chicago that there's 50 aldermen and they're pretty much terrified of opposing him and the money and the power that he has to hurt them and to prevent them from getting reelected. So this is a pretty big deal to have this much turmoil in the aldermanic races. A few of these major coalitions in Chicago that are bringing together unions and community groups and faith-based groups had actually sort of shifted their focus away from the mayor's race and worked really hard on a number of these different city council races with the idea that that would be the more realistic way to build a new movement and to leverage power in the city. And it's pretty, I think people are also pretty pleasantly surprised and excited about how those races went. The individual races are important in their own right because the aldermen could have, if they chose to, theoretically, power to change things in city council and also in their own wards. And then it's also a referendum on Rahm himself and on the system and the way of governing that Rahm represents. And also even going back before Rahm, just this idea that, the whole concept of a political machine and the idea that aldermen have to be a rubber stamp. I mean, it would be premature, to say it's being dismantled or seriously challenged, but it's definitely it's more of a shakeup than we've seen in a long time.
Well, I want to end on this point. Certainly Rahm will be regrouping and pouring, a ton of more money into this race. I think he raised something like $16 million so far. What is the mood in Rahm's camp, from what you understand, and what is the plan for the opposition? Because they're certainly going to have to take to the streets because they won't be able to counter just the money that Rahm will be able to pour in over the next few weeks.
Yeah, and one thing that's important to note is that the voter turnout was extremely low yesterday, so it'll be a whole different story in 6 weeks when presumably the voter turnout will be higher and both sides will have the chance to, work on that voter turnout. And a key issue, the third place candidate was Willie Wilson, an African-American multimillionaire businessman who definitely got a lot of the African-American vote, people who are really disenfranchised and angry at Rahm. But in some ways, Wilson's sort of politics or views on certain issues are, somewhat in line with Rahm or even to the right of Rahm. So it'll be a big wild card where that 10%, he got 10%. Plus where those voters go. So, both camps, I think Rahm and Chuy's camp, probably their number one priority right now is going after those chunk of voters as well who had voted for Wilson, along with just all the people who did not go out to vote. And yeah, Rahm has a ton of money. He had a ton of money before yesterday's election too, though, and he ran a lot of ads and he spent a lot of that money and it didn't get him the results he wanted. So I think it's been proven that money alone can't do it. It'll be really interesting to see, the challenge is probably more on Chuy Garcia's campaign to tap the groundswell of both disenchantment and with Rahm and excitement that's out there and, see what they can do in 6 weeks.
And we'll link to your interviews about Mayor 1%, Rahm Emmanuel, on the rise of Chicago's 99% at the bottom of the story. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.